Hey guys, it's Greg with Apple Explained, and today we're going to explore the history of the iPhone camera. This topic won last week's voting poll, and if you didn't get to vote, make sure you're subscribed. That way the voting polls will show up right in your activity feed, and you can let me know what video you'd like to see next. When Apple launched the iPhone in 2007, no one imagined that in just 10 years it would become the most popular camera in the world. But it may not be surprising to photographers like Chase Jarvis, who famously said, "The best camera is the one you have with you." And owning an iPhone means a camera is with you at all times. A camera that lets you focus on pointing and shooting rather than adjusting dozens of complicated settings. This level of convenience is a big reason why it dominates the digital camera market today. But the iPhone's camera hasn't always been thought of so favorably. Let's go back to 2007 and take a closer look at the camera included with the original iPhone. One of the first things you might notice about this camera is that it doesn't have a bump. It sat flush with the iPhone chassis, and this was the case with every iPhone model until the 6. This camera might also look kind of small, and that's because it had a 2 megapixel sensor, so the opening only had to be 4.5 millimeters wide. It took photos at a resolution of 1600 by 1200, which wasn't too shabby back then, but the photo quality you got from this camera left a lot to be desired. In fact, the two features that were criticized most about the original iPhone was its speed over the Edge network and the camera quality. So let me show you some examples. As you can see, the iPhone's camera has definitely come a long way since 2007. The photos were hazy and things got even worse in low light conditions. Also, there was no autofocus or flash or video capabilities. All you had in the camera app was a button to take a picture, and that was it. And not much changed with the next generation camera on the iPhone 3G. It was still 2 megapixels and still had no extra features like digital zoom or autofocus. Although Apple did add geotagging to photos so you could see the location where each photo was shot. Also, the diameter of the camera area grew by 0.5 millimeters, and no one was really sure why. I believe the change was cosmetic since the 3G was equipped with the same exact camera system as the original iPhone. So the iPhone camera didn't experience its first true upgrade until the third generation iPhone 3GS. In fact, the camera was one of the 3GS's biggest features. Apple bumped up the previous 2 megapixel system to 3 megapixels and added essential features like autofocus, auto white balance, and auto macro. There was also a tap to focus feature which allowed users to select an area for the camera to focus on. All of these new capabilities added up to photos looking a lot sharper with better color accuracy. The camera was also capable of capturing 640 by 480 VGA video, marking the first time video recording was natively supported on the iPhone. Now eventually iOS 4 came along and added 5 times digital zoom to this camera, and iOS 5 brought an autofocus lock and an auto exposure lock when users long pressed on a certain area. Now if you thought that upgrade was big, wait until you hear about the iPhone 4 camera. I should actually say cameras, since it was the first iPhone to include two, the usual rear-facing camera plus a front-facing camera. Let's talk about the rear camera first. The iPhone jumped from a 3 megapixel sensor on the 3GS to a 5 megapixel backside illuminated sensor on the 4. And what is a backside illuminated sensor? Well, because this was the first iPhone camera to use multiple lens elements, Apple could arrange those elements in a special way to capture more light and improve low light performance. There were a couple more features that helped with low light performance though, and those were the 2.8 aperture lens, which allowed more light to hit the image sensor, and the inclusion of an LED flash. Video recording achieved HD quality at 720p and 30 frames per second. Now, the rear-facing camera had matured into a very capable shooter, but the front-facing camera was brand new and the quality showed. It was only 0.3 megapixels and recorded VGA video, which looked underwhelming compared to the rear camera. But it worked just fine for the occasional selfie and FaceTime call, which was Apple's purpose for including it. Now, even though the next generation iPhone was an S model, the 4S increased the rear camera's resolution yet again from 5 megapixels to 8 megapixels, finally making it worthy of replacing most point-and-shoot cameras. And this is when Apple started referring to the iPhone's rear camera as an eyesight camera, which served as a way to distinguish it from the iPhone's front-facing, lower-quality camera. Video recording on the 4S was upgraded, taking it to full 1080p HD resolution. There was also a more complex element array in the 4S's camera system, which, along with Apple's A5 chip, allowed the camera to provide face detection for still photos and about 30% better photo clarity and color accuracy compared to the iPhone 4. The built-in gyroscope allowed for some image stabilization for the camera while recording video, although it still had room for improvement, since state-of-the-art image stabilization algorithms don't really need a gyroscope, but image processing instead. Other features of the camera was improved macro capabilities for close-up shots and faster image capture, since it was able to take its first picture in 1.1 seconds and a following picture just half a second later. Now onto the iPhone 5. Its iSight camera was still 8 megapixels like the iPhone 4S, but the actual camera sensor improved to take better photos in low light and to take photos even quicker. And after 2 generations of low-quality selfies and VGA FaceTime calls, the iPhone 5 boosted the front-facing camera quality to 1.2 megapixels, allowing users to actually see some detail in their faces for once. This also allowed the front-facing camera to record video in 720p HD resolution. And thanks to iOS 6, the iPhone 5 could take beautiful panoramic photos by simply holding up the device and panning it across the landscape. Now this 8 megapixel iSight camera stayed around for the iPhone 5S, although the aperture was improved from 2.4 to 2.2 to let in even more light. The flash was also upgraded from a single LED to a dual LED True Tone module. One LED was the traditional white color, while the other was amber. But they didn't just flash simultaneously. When you took a picture with flash enabled, the iSight camera used software algorithms to assess the color temperature of the scene. That allowed the iPhone 5S to determine just the right percentage and intensity of white versus amber light you needed, using over 1,000 unique combinations. This gave photos more accurate colors and skin tones as opposed to the washed out photos from a single LED. 2 more new features of this camera was slow motion video capture at 120 frames per second and fast continuous photo shooting capable of capturing 10 photos a second. Now the iPhone 5C was released alongside the 5S, but its camera system was exactly the same as the iPhone 5, so there isn't much to add. So let's move on to the iPhone 6. This is when the camera bump became an unfortunate reality for the iPhone line. In fact, you can find videos of users demonstrating the inconveniences of this bump when it came to things like laying the iPhone 6 on a flat surface. But this protrusion was necessary in order to house its camera system, which had a number of advantages despite having the same 8 megapixels and 5-element lens as its predecessor. The new camera included 240 frames per second slow motion and a time-lapse video in addition to something called focus pixels. This feature was enabled by the 6's new image signal processor and provided the sensor with more information about your image, enabling better and faster autofocusing. Face detection technology was improved to recognize faces faster and more accurately, and users could finally control the exposure manually by tapping and dragging up or down on the display. Auto image stabilization tried compensating for motion blur and handshaking by taking 4 photos with short exposure time and then stitching the best parts of those photos together into one optimized image. Now the iPhone 6 Plus had all those features in addition to optical image stabilization that worked with the A8 chip, gyroscope, and M8 motion coprocessor to measure motion data that provided precise lens movement to compensate for handshake. And the front-facing camera for both models were upgraded with a new sensor and a 2.2 aperture lens, along with support for burst and HDR modes. After years of sticking with an 8 megapixel sensor, the iPhone 6S and 6S Plus cameras finally moved up to 12 megapixels, allowing for even larger high-quality images. And this brought with it some exciting features like 4K video recording, increased panorama resolutions from 43 megapixels to 63 megapixels, and live photos. But you had to be careful recording in 4K, since 40 minutes of footage would completely fill up a 16GB iPhone 6S. The front-facing camera received a major upgrade, jumping from 1.2 megapixels to 5 megapixels, and Retina Flash, where the screen flashes 3 times brighter just before selfies are taken, made skin tones look more natural. Now the iPhone SE was released between the 6S and the 7, and its camera system was also caught between 2 iPhones. The iSight camera was identical to the 6S, while the front-facing camera was borrowed from the 5S, and the SE was the last iPhone to feature a flush camera without a bump. But the next big camera upgrade arrived with the iPhone 7. It had the same 12 megapixel iSight camera, but it was upgraded to a wider 1.8 aperture, which paired with the new 6-element lens meant the iPhone 7 took even better low-light photos. And the new quad LED True Tone flash was 50% brighter than the 6S. I should also point out that the new camera bump no longer had a metal ring. Instead, Apple tried blending the bump so it appeared to melt into the iPhone's chassis for a much sleeker look. And optical image stabilization came to the iPhone 7, which meant the feature was no longer exclusive to the Plus model. Instead, something called Portrait Mode was featured on the 7 Plus, which created a depth of field effect that kept faces sharp while creating a beautifully blurred background. This was made possible by a telephoto lens that also brought 2x optical zoom to the 7 Plus. The front FaceTime HD camera on both models was upgraded to 7 megapixels and included something called wide color capture, which improved color accuracy. Now onto the iPhone 8. The camera bump was no longer seamlessly integrated into the chassis due to its glass back. Instead, Apple returned to a metal bump like on the 6S. The camera was still 12 megapixels with a 1.8 aperture, but there was a new slow sync flash feature that would evenly light flash photography to make photos look even more realistic. Instead of a bright subject and dark background, slow sync exposed both so that the lighting in your photos appeared more natural. As for video, iPhone 8 added the option to record footage at 24 and 60 frames per second, and upgrading to the 8 Plus got you a new camera feature called portrait lighting, which used facial detection and depth maps to create and edit portraits with various shadow and spotlight effects. Now let's talk about the iPhone X. Its rear-facing camera system was virtually the same as the iPhone 8, except the telephoto lens was upgraded from a 2.8 to a 2.4 aperture, and the lens received optical image stabilization. The front-facing camera experienced a bigger upgrade though, thanks to the True Depth sensor, which enabled portrait lighting and features like Animoji and Memoji. So that is the history of the iPhone camera, and if you want to vote for the next video topic, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.